In the spring of 1597, approximately 900 Jewish men, women, and children were marched out of their homes across the Duchy of Milan. They had been given 2 months to leave. The poor were forced out first, given an escort of soldiers and 5,000 florins in gold for travel expenses. The rest followed after Easter, then more after Pentecost. By summer, a community that had existed in this corner of northern Italy for over 1,000 years was gone. The order came from King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, the same king whose father had expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492, the same dynasty that had pushed them out of Sicily in 1493, then Naples in 1541. Milan was the last Spanish territory in Europe where Jews still lived. And now that, too, was ending. But here's what makes this story different from every other expulsion you've heard about. This one took 32 years. Philip II first ordered the Jews expelled from Milan in 1565. For 3 decades after that, the local Italian authorities refused to carry it out. The Milanese Senate wrote lengthy defenses of their Jewish residents. Spanish governors stationed in Milan actually helped Jewish leaders travel to Madrid to plead their case directly to the king. A Jewish spy who had served the Spanish crown on 10 separate intelligence missions against the Ottoman Empire was granted a personal audience with Philip himself, begging him to spare his community. And still, in the end, they were all expelled. So what happened? Why did a community that had survived the fall of Rome, the chaos of medieval Italy, and 2 centuries of political upheaval finally meet its end in 1597? Why did local officials fight so hard to protect people their own church told them to despise? And what was it about this particular moment, this particular king, this particular decade that finally made expulsion inevitable? To understand how 900 people lost everything in 1597, we need to go back more than 1,000 years, back to when the first Jews arrived in Milan, and the strange, contradictory relationship that would define their existence in this city for centuries. The Jewish presence in Milan stretches back to the late Roman period, possibly even earlier. Archaeologists have recovered 3 Jewish inscriptions from the first centuries of the Common Era, 2 of which reference a pater communitatis, a father of the community, suggesting an organized Jewish population with formal leadership. There's evidence that stones from an ancient Jewish cemetery were incorporated into the walls of the Ambrosian Basilica, the famous church that still stands in Milan today. A synagogue existed in the city by at least the 4th century. But if you want to understand the tone of Jewish life in Milan, you need to start with one man, the patron saint of the city himself, Saint Ambrose. In 388 AD, a Christian mob burned down a synagogue in a town called Callinicum, in what's now Syria. The Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered the local bishop to rebuild the synagogue at Christian expense. A reasonable response, you might think. Property was destroyed. The law said it should be restored. Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, disagreed. He pressured Theodosius to reverse the order. He argued that Christians should never be forced to build a synagogue. And then, in a letter that survives to this day, Ambrose expressed regret that he himself had not led his own congregation in burning down the synagogue in Milan. He called it destroyed by act of God. That was in the 4th century. The attitude it represented would persist for the next 1,200 years. About a century later, around 507 AD, the rebuilt synagogue in Milan was sacked again, this time by another Christian mob. The Ostrogothic ruler Theodoric condemned the violence and ordered the synagogue restored. But the pattern had been established. Jews could live in Milan. They could rebuild after attacks, but they were never truly safe, never truly accepted, always one sermon or one angry crowd away from losing everything. Then came a period of minimal documentation. Centuries passed with little written about Jews in Milan. When they reappear in the historical record in significant numbers, it's the 13th century, and they're arriving from the German lands to the north. Ashkenazi Jews, fleeing persecution elsewhere, looking for new opportunities in the prosperous cities of northern Italy. They came as moneylenders. And this is where the story gets complicated. Because money lending would define Jewish life in the Duchy of Milan for the next 300 years. It would be the reason rulers protected them, the reason Christian merchants resented them, and eventually one of the key justifications used to expel them. But we need to understand why Jews became moneylenders in the first place. It wasn't a choice born of greed, as the preachers claimed. It was a choice born of exclusion. Throughout medieval Europe, Jews were progressively barred from owning land, joining guilds, practicing most trades, and holding public office. The economic activities available to them were narrow and shrinking. Money lending emerged as one of the few occupations open to them, in part because the church had declared it a sin for Christians to charge interest on loans. This created a peculiar arrangement. Christian society needed credit to function. Merchants needed capital. Farmers needed loans to survive bad harvests. Craftsmen needed money to buy materials. But Christians couldn't legally provide this credit, so Jews did it instead. The church's position was essentially this: usury is sinful, so we won't do it ourselves. But someone needs to do it, so we'll let the Jews handle it. And then we'll condemn them for doing what we ask them to do. It was a system designed to generate resentment. And there was another dimension to Jewish life in Milan that rarely gets discussed. Not all Jews were moneylenders. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Jewish communities of the duchy included physicians, merchants, scholars, printers, and artisans. Jewish doctors served at the courts of Italian nobles, their medical expertise valued despite their religious status. Jewish merchants traded in silk, spices, grain, and wool, connecting Milan to commercial networks across the Mediterranean and beyond. In Cremona, the center of Jewish life in the duchy, Hebrew printing became a major industry. After Venice temporarily shut down its Hebrew presses in 1553, Cremona emerged as one of the most important centers of Hebrew book production in Europe. Jewish and Christian printers worked together, producing religious texts, legal commentaries, and works of philosophy that circulated throughout the Jewish diaspora. The scholar Joseph Ottolenghi established a Talmudic academy in Cremona that attracted students from across Europe. Young men came from Germany, Poland, and the Ottoman territories to study with him. Cremona was not just a commercial center, but an intellectual one, a place where Jewish learning flourished despite all the restrictions. None of this fit the stereotype of the parasitic Jewish usurer. The reality was far more complex. But the stereotype persisted because it served the interests of those who wanted Jews gone. But before we get to that, we need to talk about what happened in 1320. That year, during what the chronicles call a great persecution of heretics, the authorities in Milan made a decision that would shape Jewish life in the city for centuries. The podesta, the chief magistrate, was obliged to promise to expel all Jews from the city of Milan itself and bar their readmission, quote, in opposition to the wishes of the archbishop. This established what became known as the 3-day rule. Jews could enter the city of Milan, they could conduct business there, but they could not stay for more than 3 consecutive days. If you were Jewish and you wanted to live in the territory of Milan, you had to live in one of the surrounding towns: Cremona, Pavia, Lodi, Alessandria, never in Milan itself. This rule persisted through the entire Visconti dynasty, through the Sforza dynasty, through the Spanish takeover, for nearly 300 years, until the final expulsion in 1597. The Jewish communities of the Duchy of Milan existed in a kind of legal twilight. They were part of the territory but banned from its capital, protected by the Duke but restricted by ancient decree, useful enough to keep around, but never quite welcome enough to live where they chose. And that tension between usefulness and rejection, between protection and restriction, would define everything that came next. Because in 1387, something important happened. The powerful Gian Galeazzo Visconti, ruler of Milan, granted significant privileges to Jews throughout Lombardy. For the first time, there was an official framework. Jews could settle in the surrounding towns. They could operate loan banks. They could practice medicine. They could trade. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. This protection came through a system called the condotta. It was a charter, a safe conduct agreement granted by the ruler for a fixed period, usually 5 to 10 years. It specified exactly what Jews were allowed to do, how much they had to pay in taxes, and what restrictions they had to follow. Here's what that meant in practice. Jewish residence in the duchy was never a right. It was a renewable privilege. Every few years, the entire community had to hope that whoever was in power would choose to renew their permission to exist. If the ruler changed, or the political winds shifted, or someone offered the Duke more money than the Jews could pay, everything could vanish overnight. The condotta created a peculiar psychology. Jews couldn't plan for the long term. They couldn't build as though they would be there forever. Every investment, every business decision, every life choice was shadowed by the knowledge that it all depended on a piece of paper that would expire in a few years. This uncertainty had practical consequences. Jewish families who might have invested in land, in permanent buildings, in long-term enterprises, instead kept their wealth in liquid forms: gold, silver, easily transportable goods. They knew they might have to leave at any moment. They planned accordingly. The condotta also created leverage for the rulers. Every renewal was an opportunity to extract more money, impose new conditions, demonstrate power. The Jews couldn't refuse. They couldn't negotiate from strength. They could only offer what they had and hope it was enough. And there was always the threat, explicit or implicit, always present. If you don't pay enough, if you don't serve well enough, if you cause any trouble at all, the condotta won't be renewed. And then where will you go? This was the sword hanging over every Jewish community in Italy. Not just Milan, Venice, Florence, Rome, all of them operated under similar systems. The details varied, but the fundamental dynamic was the same. Jewish existence depended on Christian tolerance, and Christian tolerance had to be purchased anew every few years. This wasn't stability. This was survival by negotiation. And for the next 200 years, that's exactly what the Jews of Milan did. They negotiated, they paid, they served. They made themselves useful enough that one ruler after another decided it was worth keeping them around. But they were never safe, and eventually the negotiations failed. The question is why? Why, after 2 centuries of successful survival, did the system finally collapse? What changed in the decades before 1597 that made all those careful negotiations worthless? The answer begins with a family that promised protection, delivered prosperity, and then watched helplessly as everything they'd built was torn apart. The answer begins with the Sforza. The Sforza dynasty came to power in Milan in 1450, and their treatment of Jews has been described by historians as generally just. But that word, just, hides a lot of complexity. Francesco Sforza, the dynasty's founder, took the Jews of Cremona under his personal protection in 1456. The reason he gave? Quote, because of their fidelity to the state. This wasn't charity. This was a transaction. The Jews had proven useful, so the Duke would keep them safe. And they were useful, extremely useful. Under the condotta system, Jews were compelled to maintain loan banks in every town in Lombardy. Not invited to, compelled to. Even in towns where they lost money, they were required to keep operating. The dukes needed someone to provide credit to the poor, to fund small merchants, to keep money flowing through the economy. Christians were forbidden by church law from charging interest on loans. Jews were not, so the Jews became the bankers. And for this service, they paid. They paid heavily. The taxes imposed on Jewish communities in the Duchy of Milan were exceptional by Italian standards. Annual payments to the ducal treasury, special levies during times of war, fees for renewing the condotta, fees for resolving disputes, fees for the privilege of existing at all. Consider what this meant in practice. A Jewish family in Cremona in the late 15th century might earn a decent living from their loan bank or trading business, but a significant portion of that income went directly to the Duke. And when the condata came up for renewal, the community had to negotiate the terms all over again. The Duke might demand more money. He might impose new restrictions. He might use the renewal process to extract concessions. This wasn't just taxation. It was a perpetual state of negotiation, of proving your worth, of demonstrating that you were more valuable alive and paying than expelled and replaced. And the Jews of Milan proved their worth in ways that went beyond money. Jewish physicians were particularly valued. Despite church prohibitions against Christians seeking medical treatment from Jews, wealthy Christians did it anyway. Jewish doctors had access to medical texts in Hebrew and Arabic that weren't available in Latin translation. They had connections to medical traditions in the Islamic world, where medicine was more advanced. When you were sick, religious scruples often took a back seat to survival. Several Jewish physicians served at the Sforza court itself. They treated dukes and their families, earning personal exemptions from anti-Jewish restrictions as a reward for their services. Medicine was one area where Jewish expertise was simply too valuable to ignore. Then there was intelligence. The Jewish communities of Italy were connected to other Jewish communities across the Mediterranean. They had relatives in Venice, in Constantinople, in Alexandria, in Salonika. They spoke multiple languages. They traveled for business, and they heard things. Rulers quickly realized that Jews could be useful sources of information. A Jewish merchant returning from the Ottoman Empire might know things about Turkish military preparations that no Christian spy could discover. A Jewish banker with connections in Venice might hear rumors about Venetian diplomatic intentions. The same networks that made Jews successful in trade made them valuable as informants. This would become crucial in the decades before the expulsion. But we'll get to that. In exchange, they got protection. Successive Sforza dukes confirmed the privileges originally granted by the Visconti. Jewish physicians served the court. The scholar Joseph Ottolenghi established a famous Talmudic academy in Cremona that attracted students from across Europe. Jewish merchants traded in salt, sugar, cheese, and wine, using family connections to import spices from across the Mediterranean. By the late 15th century, Cremona had become the most important Jewish center in the entire duchy. Jews lived primarily on the Via Giudecca, which still exists today under the name Via Zuecca, but their shops and businesses were scattered throughout the city. Unlike in many other Italian cities, Cremona never established a compulsory ghetto. Jews and Christians lived as neighbors, conducted business together, passed each other in the streets. The population was substantial but not overwhelming. A census from 1590, taken in the decades before the expulsion, counted 456 Jews in Cremona. Other towns had smaller communities. Alessandria, Lodi, Pavia, Como, all had Jewish residents engaged in banking, trade, and various crafts. It wasn't equality, but it was something. However, this prosperity came with resentment. By the 1460s, the Jewish community in Cremona had grown large enough that Christian citizens petitioned Princess Bianca Maria Visconti to halt further Jewish immigration. They were getting too numerous, the petition implied, too successful, too visible. The petition reveals the contradictory nature of Christian attitudes toward Jews. On one hand, Jews were condemned as inferior, as enemies of Christ, as people deserving of subordination. On the other hand, they were resented precisely because they were succeeding. The stereotype said Jews should be degraded. The reality was that some Jewish families were prospering, building fine homes, educating their children, living lives that looked uncomfortably similar to those of their Christian neighbors. This cognitive dissonance fueled resentment. If Jews were supposed to be cursed by God, why were they doing so well? The answer for many Christians was that something was wrong. The Jews must be cheating somehow. They must be exploiting Christians. They must be using unfair advantages. And then there were the accusations. The most common was usury. Christian preachers, particularly the Franciscans, railed against Jewish moneylenders from pulpits across Lombardy. They described Jewish money as an abscess, draining the natural warmth of the city. They painted images of rapacious Jewish bankers extracting crushing interest from helpless Christian peasants. But here's what the historical record actually shows. When Spanish officials conducted surveys of the duchy's Jews in the decades before the expulsion, they collected testimony from local officials across the region. And those testimonies, preserved in the archives of Milan and Simancas, tell a different story. The majority of Milan's Jews, these officials reported, served a poor clientele that borrowed money for sustenance, not for business ventures, for food, for rent, for survival. The interest rates charged by Jewish lenders were comparable to those charged by the Christian charitable institutions called Monte di Pietà, which ranged from 4 to 15%. The voracious usurer of Franciscan sermons was, in most cases, a modest banker serving clients no one else would lend to, but the accusation stuck, and it would be used against them for centuries. Then there was the question of conversion. The Church's official position on Jews was complicated. On one hand, they were condemned as Christ killers, stubborn rejectors of the true faith, people whose continued existence was a theological problem. On the other hand, their conversion to Christianity was seen as essential to the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Jews couldn't simply be killed or permanently expelled. They had to be maintained, kept available for the eventual mass conversion that would signal the end times. This created a strange incentive structure. But Jewish communities were protected in part because they needed to exist for Christians to convert them. And conversion efforts were constant. Compulsory sermons delivered by preachers with knowledge of Hebrew, forced attendance at Christian religious services, children separated from parents to receive Christian education. These weren't isolated incidents. They were official policy, mandated by church councils and enforced by zealous bishops. And some Jews did convert, whether from genuine belief or exhaustion or the promise of better opportunities. Some individuals crossed over, but the community persisted. Generation after generation, they maintained their faith, their traditions, their identity. The Church found this baffling. Why wouldn't these people simply accept the truth? The answer, according to the preachers, must be obstinacy or wickedness, a deliberate choice to reject salvation. And then, in 1475, something happened that would poison Jewish-Christian relations across northern Italy for generations. In the town of Trent, about 100 miles northeast of Milan, a 2-year-old Christian boy named Simon disappeared just before Easter. His body was found in the cellar of a Jewish home. Under torture, 15 Jewish men confessed to murdering the child and using his blood for ritual purposes. It was a lie. The entire accusation, which we now call blood libel, was a fabrication that had been circulating in Europe since at least the 12th century. There was no ritual murder. There was no use of Christian blood in Jewish ceremonies. The confessions were extracted through weeks of brutal torture. The accused Jews were subjected to strappado, a torture method where the victim is suspended by their arms tied behind their back, dislocating the shoulders. They were burned with hot irons. They were kept awake for days. Under this treatment, they confessed to whatever their torturers wanted to hear. But the men were burned at the stake anyway, and Simon of Trent was declared a martyr. The case generated massive propaganda. Woodcuts depicting the alleged murder circulated throughout Europe, showing Jews with exaggerated features holding knives over the child's body. The images were designed to provoke hatred, and they succeeded. The Franciscan preacher Bernardino of Feltre, whose sermons in Trent had directly preceded the accusations, became famous for his anti-Jewish preaching. He traveled from city to city, spreading the story of Simon's martyrdom and demanding action against Jewish communities. The Jewish Encyclopedia records that the case aroused hatred against their coreligionists in the territory of Milan, fanned by the speeches of Bernardinus of Feltre. Pope Sixtus IV initially sent a legate to investigate the case, and the investigation found serious problems with the trial. The confessions were clearly obtained through torture. The evidence was questionable, but local pressure for the cult of Simon was too strong. The Pope eventually permitted veneration to continue. In 1583, nearly a century after the original events, Simon of Trent was inserted into the Roman liturgical calendar. His feast day became an official part of Catholic worship. The blood libel wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was institutionalized in the official ceremonies of the Church. Every year on that feast day, Catholics throughout Europe commemorated a martyrdom that had never happened, reinforcing the belief that Jews murdered Christian children. The weight of institutional authority, of liturgical tradition, of annual celebration made the lie feel like truth. The Catholic Church didn't revoke Simon's beatification until 1965, as part of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. For nearly 500 years, the Church had officially commemorated a blood libel victim, lending its authority to one of the most destructive anti-Semitic myths in history. For the Jews of Milan, living just 100 miles from Trent, the shadow of Simon hung over everything. Every Easter season brought renewed danger, as the story of the child's death was retold in sermons and commemorations. Any unexplained death of a Christian child could trigger accusations. Any dispute with a Christian neighbor could escalate into a blood libel charge. This was the atmosphere in which the Jews of Milan lived. Not just economic competition, not just religious condemnation, but the constant, lurking possibility that they might be accused of the most horrific crime imaginable, based on a lie that the Church itself had made official. So this was the situation Jews in Milan found themselves in by the end of the 15th century, protected by dukes who valued their economic contributions, resented by Christian merchants who saw them as competitors, accused by preachers of unspeakable crimes, required to listen to sermons urging them to abandon their faith, taxed heavily for the privilege of existing at all. It was precarious, but it was sustainable. The condotta system kept renewing. The dukes kept collecting their taxes. The Jewish community kept surviving. And then, in 1535, everything changed. The Sforza dynasty fell. Milan passed into the hands of the Spanish Habsburgs. And suddenly, the Jews of the duchy found themselves living under the rule of the same royal family that had expelled their ancestors from Spain 43 years earlier. The takeover happened as part of the Italian Wars, the decades-long struggle between France and Spain for control of the Italian peninsula. The last Sforza Duke, Francesco II, died without an heir in 1535. Under the terms of various treaties and dynastic claims, the duchy passed to Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was simultaneously King Charles I of Spain. Charles combined the Spanish and imperial crowns, creating a realm that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, from the Netherlands to Naples. Milan was just one small piece of this vast empire, but for the Jews who lived there, the change of sovereignty was potentially catastrophic. Charles V himself wasn't particularly focused on Jewish policy. He had too many other concerns. The Protestant Reformation was splitting Europe apart. The Ottoman Empire was threatening Vienna. The newly discovered Americas needed to be colonized and exploited. Compared to these challenges, the few hundred Jews in Milan barely registered. But Charles understood the importance of religious uniformity for political stability. He had expelled Jews from Naples in 1541, on completing the work his grandfather Ferdinand had begun. He was a Catholic monarch, committed to the defense of the faith. If the circumstances were right, he would not hesitate to expel Jews from Milan as well. The circumstances, for the moment, weren't right. The Italian Wars continued until 1559, and Charles needed stability in Milan. The Jewish community continued to function, paying its taxes, renewing its condotta, serving its purpose. But everyone knew that the situation had fundamentally changed. The old Italian arrangement, where Jews were protected by pragmatic local rulers who valued their economic contributions, was giving way to something new. The Spanish Habsburgs ruled from Madrid, not Milan. They answered to ideological pressures that local Italian rulers had never faced. They saw Jewish expulsion as a mark of Catholic piety, a fulfillment of religious duty. a continuation of the great work Ferdinand and Isabella had begun in 1492. The clock was now ticking. The only question was how long they had left. The Spanish Habsburg takeover of Milan in 1535 didn't change things overnight. The Condotta system continued. Jewish merchants kept trading. Jewish bankers kept lending. On the surface, life went on much as before. But the new rulers brought something with them that the Visconti and Sforza had not: an ideology. The Spanish Habsburgs had expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for the Americas. It was one of the defining acts of Ferdinand and Isabella's reign, a statement that Spain would be a purely Catholic kingdom, purified of Jewish and Muslim presence. The principle they established was called limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Even converted Jews, even families that had been Christian for generations, were suspect if they had Jewish ancestry. This ideology was central to Spanish identity. The expulsion of 1492 wasn't just a policy decision, it was a founding myth. Spain defined itself as the kingdom that had completed the Reconquista, driven out the Moors, expelled the Jews, purified itself of religious contamination. This self-image was reinforced by decades of propaganda, by histories that celebrated Ferdinand and Isabella as Catholic heroes, by religious ceremonies that commemorated the triumph of the faith. Philip II inherited this ideology along with his crown. He had been raised to see Jewish expulsion not as cruelty but as piety, and not as economic folly but as religious necessity. His father, Charles V, had expelled Jews from Naples in 1541. His grandparents had expelled them from Spain itself. For Philip, completing the work of his predecessors was a sacred duty. This ideology traveled with the Spanish armies. When they took Sicily in 1493, the Jews were expelled. When they consolidated control over Naples in 1541, the Jews were expelled from there too. Milan was the last major Spanish territory in Italy where Jews still lived. And the Jews of Milan knew it. They knew who their new masters were. They knew the history. They had to wonder every time the Condotta came up for renewal whether this would be the year the Spanish decided to finish what Ferdinand and Isabella had started. But for 3 decades after 1535, the blow didn't fall. The Spanish governors of Milan were practical men. They saw the economic value of Jewish moneylenders and merchants. They collected the heavy taxes. They maintained the old arrangements. Why didn't Philip act sooner? Part of the answer is distraction. Philip II ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. He was fighting wars on multiple fronts, against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against French rivals in Italy, against English pirates in the Atlantic. The fate of a few hundred Jews in Milan was not his most pressing concern. Part of the answer is local resistance. As we'll see, the Milanese authorities had no enthusiasm for expulsion. They found ways to delay, to obstruct, to make the process so complicated that Philip couldn't easily force the issue. And part of the answer is Philip's own personality. He was a meticulous bureaucrat who insisted on reviewing every decision personally. The sheer volume of paperwork that crossed his desk meant that many issues were delayed for years while he worked through the backlog. Jewish expulsion from Milan was important, but so were 1,000 other matters competing for his attention. Then came the Counter-Reformation. To understand what happened to the Jews of Milan, you have to understand what was happening to the Catholic Church in the middle of the 16th century. Martin Luther had posted his 95 Theses in 1517. The Protestant Reformation was tearing Europe apart. Entire kingdoms were abandoning Rome. The Church was in crisis. The response was the Counter-Reformation, a massive effort to reform Catholicism from within and combat Protestant heresies from without. The Council of Trent, which met between 1545 and 1563, established new doctrines, new standards for clergy, new institutions for enforcing orthodoxy. And somewhere in this process, the Church's attitude toward Jews hardened dramatically. Before the 1550s, popes had generally adopted pragmatic attitudes toward Jewish communities. Yes, they were theologically condemned. Yes, they should eventually convert. But in the meantime, they paid taxes and provided useful services. Pope Alexander VI had even welcomed 9,000 impoverished Spanish Jews to the Papal States after the 1492 expulsion. Pope Paul IV changed everything. On July 14, 1555, Paul IV issued a papal bull called Cum Nimis Absurdum. The title means, "Since it is absurd." And here is what the Pope found absurd: that the Jews, who through their own fault were condemned by God to eternal slavery, should presume to dwell and mix with Christians and near their churches. The bull established the Roman ghetto, forcing all Jews in Rome into a single walled quarter that would not be abolished until 1870. It required Jews to wear distinctive yellow clothing at all times. It prohibited them from owning real estate. It mandated compulsory attendance at Catholic sermons every Saturday. It restricted their ability to employ Christian servants, engage in most trades, or practice medicine on Christian patients. This wasn't persecution by angry mobs. This was systematic degradation imposed by the highest authority in the Catholic Church. The next pope, Pius V, went further. Pius was a former Dominican inquisitor with a personal record of aggressive prosecution of heretics. On February 26, 1569, he issued a bull called Hebriorum Gens, which accused Jews of magical incantations, superstition, and witchcraft. The bull expelled Jews from the entire Papal States except for 2 cities, Rome and Ancona. They were given 90 days to leave. Subsequent popes oscillated. Sixtus V, who reigned from 1585 to 1590, canceled the expulsion and eased some restrictions. But Clement VIII, in 1593, issued his own bull, Cecca et Obdurata, re-expelling Jews from all papal territories except Rome, Ancona, and Avignon. What did this have to do with Milan? Milan wasn't part of the Papal States. The Pope couldn't directly order the Spanish governors to do anything, but the Church had influence. And in Milan, that influence was personified by one man, Carlo Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan from 1564 until his death in 1584. Borromeo was arguably the most important Counter-Reformation figure in northern Italy. He was a nephew of Pope Pius IV. He had helped organize the final sessions of the Council of Trent. He was a fierce advocate for church reform, a builder of seminaries, a pastor who personally ministered to plague victims during the epidemic of 1576. He would be canonized as a saint in 1610, and he was, in the words of the Jewish chronicler Joseph HaKohen, an enemy of the Jews. Borromeo's provincial councils in 1565 and 1579 passed specific anti-Jewish legislation. Jews were required to attend compulsory missionary sermons delivered by preachers who knew Hebrew. Children were to be separated from their parents for Christian education. When Pope Pius V ordered Jews to wear the distinctive badge and forbade them from lending at interest, Borromeo extended these measures to all Jews in Lombardy, not just those in papal territories. HaKohen wrote that Borromeo enforced the decrees and bulls which the Pope had issued against the Jews most expeditiously. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because Borromeo's private correspondence, analyzed by historian Renata Segre, reveals a more complex figure. In one letter, Borromeo wrote that expelling them makes little sense because it simply means moving them from one Catholic state to another. In another, he expressed deep cynicism about Jewish conversions. I have little faith in them and have been deceived many times by this sort of people. Because under the pretext of coming to our faith, I have found that many of them were seeking and had other temporal goals. Borromeo wasn't a simple fanatic. He was a sophisticated churchman who understood the political realities. He didn't necessarily believe expulsion would achieve anything meaningful, but he enforced the anti-Jewish measures anyway, because that was his duty as a Counter-Reformation bishop. He also resisted the introduction of the Spanish Inquisition into Milan, which suggests his priorities were about church authority rather than simple persecution. But for the Jews living under his ecclesiastical jurisdiction, the distinction probably didn't matter much. Meanwhile, another threat was emerging, one that attacked Jews not through theology, but through economics, the Monte di Pietà. These were charitable lending institutions established by the Franciscan order, designed explicitly to replace Jewish moneylenders. The first Monte di Pietà was founded in Perugia in 1462. The preamble of the one established in Faenza defined its purpose with perfect clarity: destruction of the perfidious voraciousness of the accursed usury, most specifically that of the Jews. Milan established its Monte di Pietà in 1483. By 1494, about 30 of these institutions operated across central and northern Italy. Between 1470 and 1570, more than 200 were created. The driving force behind the Monte movement was the Franciscan preacher Bernardino of Feltre, the same Bernardino whose sermons in Trent had preceded the blood libel accusations against the Jews there. He traveled from city to city, preaching against Jewish usury, on demanding the establishment of Monte di Pietà, whipping up popular sentiment against Jewish communities. The logic of the Monte was simple. If Christian institutions could provide loans to the poor, then Jews would no longer be necessary. Their one indispensable function would be eliminated. And without that function, what argument remained for tolerating their presence? In practice, the Monte di Pietà couldn't fully replace Jewish lending. They charged similar interest rates, typically 4 to 15%, to cover their operating costs. They had limited capital. They couldn't serve all the borrowers who needed credit. Historian Attilio Milano concluded that the coexistence of Monte di Pietà and Jewish pawn banks was not only possible but also necessary. But the existence of the Monte changed the political calculation, and rulers who might once have argued that Jews were economically essential now had an alternative, even an imperfect one. The case for tolerance was getting weaker. So by the 1560s, the Jews of Milan found themselves squeezed from multiple directions. The Spanish crown, which ruled them, had a history of expulsion stretching back 70 years. The Counter-Reformation Church, which shaped the moral framework of their society, had declared them enemies of Christ, whose presence corrupted Christian communities. The Monte di Pietà offered an alternative to their most important economic function. The blood libel of Simon of Trent, now nearly a century old, had been institutionalized in the church calendar. Archbishop Borromeo was enforcing every anti-Jewish measure he could find. And then, in 1565, Philip II of Spain decided it was time. The king issued an order for the expulsion of all Jews from the Duchy of Milan. It should have been the end. Philip was the most powerful monarch in Europe, ruling an empire that stretched from the Philippines to Peru. His word was law throughout his domains. When he ordered something, it happened. But it didn't happen. Not in 1565. Not for another 32 years. And the story of those 32 years, the story of how local officials defied their own king, how Jewish leaders negotiated desperately for survival, how one Jewish spy tried to leverage his service to the crown into protection for his people, is unlike anything else in the history of European expulsions. Because what happened in Milan wasn't just persecution. It was a battle, a 32-year legal, political, and bureaucratic battle between Madrid and Milan over the fate of 900 people. And for most of those 32 years, the locals were winning. Philip II's 1565 expulsion order should have ended Jewish life in Milan within months. Instead, it triggered something no one expected: a decades-long bureaucratic rebellion by the very officials who were supposed to carry it out. To understand why, you have to understand how the Spanish Empire actually functioned. Philip ruled from Madrid, but Milan was over 1,000 miles away. Communication took weeks. The king couldn't personally oversee every detail of governance in every territory. He relied on governors, appointed for fixed terms, to implement his policies on the ground. And those governors relied on local institutions, particularly the Milanese Senate, to actually administer the territory. The Senate was composed of Italian nobles and jurists who understood local conditions far better than any Spanish bureaucrat in Madrid ever could. They knew which policies would work and which would cause chaos. They knew the economic relationships, the social networks, the practical realities of governing a diverse territory. And when Philip's expulsion order arrived, the Senate did something remarkable. They stalled. The official justification was always practical, never ideological. The Senate didn't argue that expelling Jews was wrong. They argued that it was complicated. There were debts to settle. There were contracts to unwind. There were economic disruptions to consider. The process would take time. Month after month, year after year, the Senate found reasons to delay. And Philip, occupied with wars against the Ottomans, rebellions in the Netherlands, the invasion of England, and 100 other crises, didn't force the issue. In 1571, Philip personally annotated a report on the Jewish question with his own handwriting. The document survives in the archives at Simancas. He was clearly interested, clearly wanted action. But still, nothing happened. In 1574, the governor of Milan wrote to Philip with a telling admission. He acknowledged that a Jewish man named Vidal had served the Spanish state well. The governor's words, preserved in the archives. Vidal el Hebreo es muy inteligente y ha servido. Vidal, the Jew, is very intelligent and has served. This was the paradox at the heart of the Milan situation. The same Jews that the king wanted expelled were providing valuable services to the crown. For expulsion, another official could point to specific Jews who had made themselves useful to Spain. And then came the incident that changed everything. In 1582, in Cremona, a Christian man killed a Jew. The details of the case have been lost, but the outcome was extraordinary. The Christian murderer was put to death for his crime. Think about what that meant in 16th century Europe. A Christian was executed for killing a Jew. In a territory where Jews were barely tolerated, where they were officially condemned by the church, where preachers regularly accused them of unspeakable crimes, the law had been applied equally. This was extraordinary. In most of Europe, a Jewish life was worth less than Christian life in the eyes of the law. Crimes against Jews were punished lightly, if at all. For a Christian to be executed for murdering a Jew suggested that the authorities in Milan were treating Jews as full members of the community, as people whose lives had equal value under the law. The Christians of Cremona and Pavia were outraged. They organized a delegation to Philip II. They demanded that he banish all Jews from the duchy, not because of anything the Jews had done, but because the punishment of a Christian for killing a Jew was intolerable to them. The application of equal justice was the offense. Philip responded by ordering a census of the Jewish population. But once again, he didn't proceed with expulsion. According to the records, the Jews had been useful during a recent famine. They had helped feed the population when food was scarce. The king decided that their services outweighed the demands of the petitioners. But the petitioners didn't give up. The citizens of Cremona and Pavia would continue pushing for expulsion for the next 15 years, eventually offering considerable sums of money as inducement. They were willing to pay to make the Jews disappear. Meanwhile, the Senate was building its defense. In 1589, the Milanese Senate produced one of the most remarkable documents in the history of Jewish-Christian relations in early modern Europe. It was a collective defense of the Jews' right to reside in the duchy, assembled by the Spanish governor himself along with senators, scholars, theologians, and local officials from across the territory. The document, preserved in the Archivio di Stato di Milano, collected testimony from officials who had actually dealt with Jews in their communities. And what those officials reported contradicted almost everything the preachers had been saying. The Jews provided economic benefits. They employed the poor. They funded intelligence operations. They lived modestly without scandal. Their interest rates were reasonable. Their contracts were fair. Far from being parasites draining Christian wealth, they were useful members of the economic order. The Senate itself was divided on the theological question. 3 members argued that usury should not be allowed regardless of profit, and therefore Jews should go. But 3 other members proposed a pragmatic compromise. If a papal exemption could be obtained and interest rates reduced, Jews should be permitted to continue lending. Philip rejected the compromise. He wanted expulsion. But the very fact that the Senate was debating the issue at all, that local officials were willing to defend Jews in writing, that the governors were facilitating these discussions rather than simply carrying out orders, shows how little enthusiasm existed in Milan for the king's policy. And this brings us to the most extraordinary figure in the entire story, a man who embodied all the contradictions of Jewish life under Spanish rule, a man who served the same king who wanted to expel his people, Simon Sacerdoti. Born around 1540 into one of the wealthiest Jewish families in the duchy, based in Alessandria, Sacerdoti lived a double life. To his community, he was a prominent banker and community leader. To the Spanish crown, he was something else entirely, a spy. Between approximately 1560 and the final expulsion, Simon Sacerdoti completed at least 10 clandestine intelligence missions against the Ottoman Empire on behalf of Philip II of Spain. The details of most of these missions remain murky, but we know he was paid up to 150 gold scudi per mission, a substantial sum that indicates the value Spain placed on his services. Think about what this meant. The same king who had ordered Sacerdoti's entire community expelled was simultaneously employing him as a secret agent against Spain's greatest enemy. Sacerdoti was risking his life for a monarch who wanted to destroy everything he cared about. Why did he do it? We can't know for certain, but the most likely explanation is protection. By making himself indispensable to the Spanish crown, Sacerdoti may have hoped to earn exemption for himself and his family, or perhaps to build enough goodwill to influence the king's policy toward all Milan's Jews. When the final expulsion order became imminent in the mid-1590s, Sacerdoti made his move. The Spanish governor of Milan at this time was Juan Fernández de Velasco, Constable of Castile, who held the position from 1592 to 1600. And Velasco did something that, on paper, should have been unthinkable. He helped the Jews. The governor issued a safe conduct for Sacerdoti to travel to Madrid and plead the Jewish community's case directly to the king. A Jew traveling to the heart of the Spanish Empire, to the court of a king who had spent his entire reign trying to purge his territories of Jewish presence, to beg for the survival of his people. Sacerdoti went, but he obtained an audience with Philip II himself. The Jewish chronicler Joseph HaKohen recorded what happened at that meeting. Sacerdoti asked the king directly why he planned to deal in this way with his servants who had assisted him and his father in times of trial. It was an appeal to reciprocity. The Jews had served Spain faithfully. They had paid their taxes. They had provided intelligence. They had maintained loan banks that kept credit flowing through the economy. In return, they asked only to be allowed to continue existing. Another Jewish ambassador, Samuel Cohen of Alessandria, also traveled to Madrid to make the case. And here's the most remarkable part. Philip listened. Sort of. The king agreed that the Spanish crown should repay all debts owed to Jews before expelling them. This was actually a major concession. One, because it meant the expulsion couldn't happen until a complex financial unwinding was complete. It would take years. But Philip didn't reverse his decision. He simply delayed it. And then the citizens of Cremona and Pavia came back with their offer. Money. Considerable sums of money according to the records. They would pay the king to expel the Jews. Philip's royal confessor was also pushing constantly for expulsion. The specific identity of this confessor isn't recorded in surviving documents, but his influence was significant. Every time practical arguments for keeping the Jews seemed to gain traction, the confessor reminded the king of his spiritual duty. And Philip was an intensely religious man. He had built the Escorial, the massive monastery palace outside Madrid, as a monument to Catholic faith. He saw himself as the champion of the Counter-Reformation, the defender of the true church against Protestant heretics and Ottoman infidels. His father, Charles V, had delayed expelling the Jews from Naples until political conditions made it possible. Philip had been waiting 30 years to finish what his father started. But even as Philip moved toward final expulsion, the resistance continued. The Milanese Senate produced report after report documenting the practical difficulties of expulsion. The unwinding of financial relationships would take years. The Monte di Pietà couldn't absorb all the lending business that Jews currently handled. The poor would suffer without access to small loans. The economy would be disrupted. These arguments weren't moral. The Senate wasn't saying expulsion was wrong. They were saying it was impractical, or expensive, and disruptive. This was the only kind of argument that had any chance of working with Philip. Appeal to his practical interests, not to justice or mercy. And for years, it worked. Every time Philip seemed ready to proceed, another practical objection emerged. Another delay was granted. Another extension was negotiated. The Jews of Milan used this time as well as they could. They continued paying their taxes, demonstrating their economic value. They continued providing intelligence, reminding the crown of their usefulness. They cultivated relationships with sympathetic officials, building a network of protectors who would argue their case. But they could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Each year, the papal pressure intensified. Each year, the citizens of Cremona and Pavia submitted new petitions. Each year, the Counter-Reformation theology that condemned Jewish presence grew more dominant in church teaching. And each year, Philip grew older. He had been a young king in 1565 when he first ordered the expulsion. By the 1590s, he was in his 60s, his health failing. He knew he was running out of time to complete the religious purification of his empire. For Philip, the expulsion of Jews from Milan was unfinished business. It was a promise he had made to God and to his father's memory. And as death approached, the urgency intensified. The Jews of Milan must have sensed this. They must have known that the delays couldn't continue forever. Every renewal of the Condotta, every extension of the deadline, was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. And yet they fought. For 32 years, they fought. Through every legal channel, every political connection, every appeal to self-interest and pragmatism. They never gave up hope that something might change, that some combination of arguments might finally convince the king to relent. It was one of the longest sustained acts of resistance in the history of Jewish-Christian relations in early modern Europe. And it failed. In March 1596, Philip issued the final and definitive order of general expulsion, 31 years after his first order. After countless petitions, reports, surveys, delays, and negotiations, after Sacerdotes' personal appeal to the throne, after the Senate's collective defense, after governors and officials across the duchy had done everything they could to slow the process, it was over. But even then there was one more delay. When the decree arrived in Milan, the Jews couldn't immediately leave because of the ongoing war in Lombardy between France and Spain. The roads weren't safe. The governor permitted them to stay temporarily until conditions improved. The final expulsion would take place in spring 1597. And as the Jews of Milan prepared to leave everything they had built over centuries, they must have wondered how it had come to this. They had done everything right. They had served faithfully. They had paid their taxes. They had made themselves useful in every way they could. Their own governor had helped their leader travel to Madrid to plead their case. It hadn't been enough. The 32 years of resistance had bought time, but not survival. The bureaucratic rebellion had slowed the machine, but not stopped it. In the end, the ideology of the Spanish crown, reinforced by the Counter-Reformation Church and paid for by the citizens of Cremona and Pavia, had proven stronger than any local arrangement. 900 people were about to lose their homes, and the only question remaining was how they would be forced out. Spring 1597. The war between France and Spain was winding down. The roads of Lombardy were safe again, and the Jews of Milan had run out of time. The expulsion was carried out in stages, with a cruel logic that made the poorest suffer first. The decree gave Jews 2 months to settle their affairs and leave. But within that 2-month window, the poor were obliged to depart before everyone else. They had less to sell, fewer debts to collect, no property to liquidate, and so they were pushed out the door earliest, given an escort of soldiers and 5,000 florins in gold for travel expenses. 5,000 florins for an entire community of poor families. Enough to survive the journey, maybe. Enough to start over somewhere else? Barely. The majority of the community departed after Easter. The remainder left after Pentecost. By summer, the Duchy of Milan was, for the first time in centuries, officially free of Jews. How many people are we talking about? Approximately 900. Some sources say close to 1,000. In the context of European expulsions, this was a small number. The 1492 expulsion from Spain had displaced somewhere between 40,000 and 200,000 people, depending on which estimates you trust. The 1290 expulsion from England had removed perhaps 3,000. Milan's 900 Jews were a rounding error in the grand sweep of medieval and early modern persecution. But 900 people is still 900 people. 900 individuals with names and families and histories. 900 people forced to abandon homes they had occupied for generations, businesses they had built, synagogues where they had prayed, cemeteries where their ancestors lay buried. We know some of their names. We know Simon Sacerdote and his family in Alessandria. We know Samuel Cohen, who traveled to Madrid to plead the community's case. We know the wealthy families who had connections to Spanish officials. And we know the poor families who were forced out first with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a share of 5,000 florins. But we don't know most of them. The historical record preserves the names of leaders, of those who left traces in official documents. The ordinary families, the craftsmen and small merchants and laborers, the women and children who had no official role but suffered the consequences nonetheless, are largely anonymous. This is how history works. The powerful leave records. The ordinary disappear. The affected communities were scattered across the duchy. Cremona, the largest, had 456 Jews as of a 1590 census. Alessandria, Lodi, Pavia, Como, and smaller towns made up the rest. All of them emptied out in those spring months of 1597. The process of leaving was itself traumatic. Families had to sell property under pressure, knowing that buyers could offer low prices because they knew the Jews had no choice. They had to collect debts from Christians who might simply refuse to pay, knowing the Jewish creditors would be gone soon anyway. They had to decide what to take and what to leave behind, knowing they might never return. Imagine packing your entire life into what you could carry, deciding which family heirlooms to bring and which to abandon, saying goodbye to neighbors you had known for decades, to the streets where you had grown up, to the synagogue where your parents had prayed, and then walking away, not knowing where you would end up or whether you would survive the journey. That was the reality of expulsion for 900 people in the spring of 1597. But not everyone left. Philip II, for all his ideological commitment to expulsion, made exceptions. And the exceptions reveal something important about how the whole system worked. 2 Jewish families were allowed to remain in each of 3 towns: Cremona, Lodi, and Alessandria. 6 families total. The reasoning was practical. These families were needed to manage the collection of outstanding debts owed to departed Jews. Someone had to wind down the financial relationships that had built up over decades, and so a handful of Jews were permitted to stay, temporarily, to do the paperwork of their own community's destruction. In Cremona, by 1629, only 1 Jewish family still remained, the Soav family, operating as loan bankers and traders. They were the last remnant of a community that had once numbered in the hundreds. And then there was Simon Sacerdote, the spy who had served Philip II on 10 intelligence missions, the man who had traveled to Madrid and pleaded with the king directly, the leader who had done everything possible to save his community and failed. He got an exemption. Philip II granted Sacerdoti and his family personal protection from the expulsion, making them the only Jews given a permanent exemption from the banishment. After 30 years of dangerous service to the Spanish crown, risking his life against the Ottomans, Sacerdoti had earned the right to remain in the territory that was expelling everyone else who shared his faith. It was a peculiar kind of reward. His community was gone. His people had been driven out. But he could stay. History doesn't record what Sacerdoti did with this exemption, how long he lived, whether he remained in the duchy or eventually chose to leave. What we know is that Philip II valued his service enough to make an exception that no one else received. And this brings us to a question that the documentary record forces us to confront, a question that's uncomfortable but historically important. What did the Jews of Milan actually do that contributed to their expulsion? The traditional narrative of expulsions focuses on persecution. Jews are victims, Christians are persecutors. The story is one of prejudice, scapegoating, and religious hatred, and all of those elements were certainly present in Milan. But history is rarely that simple. The archival record reveals a more complicated picture. Start with usury. Yes, Christian preachers exaggerated the rapacity of Jewish moneylenders. Yes, the interest rates charged by Jewish bankers were comparable to those charged by Christian Monte di Pietà. Yes, most Jewish lending served poor clients borrowing for basic survival. But there were also complaints that weren't purely fabricated. The Condotta system required Jews to maintain loan banks, even in towns where they lost money. This created an incentive to make up losses elsewhere. Some Jewish lenders charged higher rates to wealthier clients who could afford to pay more. This was rational business practice, but it fed into the narrative of Jewish greed. More significantly, the Condotta system itself created resentment. Jews had a legally protected monopoly on money lending. Christian merchants who wanted to enter the credit business couldn't compete directly. The guilds were excluded from this lucrative trade. And so even when Jewish lending practices were entirely fair, the structure of the system generated hostility. Then there was the tax fraud accusation. In the years before the expulsion, Jews were accused of fraud in regard to the taxes and were thereby deprived of the protection of the state. This charge appears in multiple sources. The specifics are unclear, but the accusation struck at the heart of the Condotta arrangement. The entire justification for tolerating Jews was that they paid heavy taxes and provided economic services. If they were cheating on their taxes, then they were violating the fundamental bargain that kept them alive. Whether the fraud accusations were accurate, exaggerated, or completely fabricated, the fact that they gained traction suggests that the Jewish community's relationship with the state had deteriorated. There were also internal tensions within the Jewish community itself. Not all Jews in Milan were wealthy bankers. Many were poor, dependent on community charity. The burden of the Condotta taxes fell unevenly. Wealthy families like the Sacerdotes could afford to maintain good relationships with Spanish officials. Poorer Jews had no such leverage. When the final expulsion came, it was the poor who were forced out first. The wealthy had more time to settle their affairs. This differential treatment may have reflected practical considerations, but it also meant that the community's most vulnerable members bore the earliest and harshest consequences. And then there was the question of conversion. Throughout the centuries of Jewish presence in Milan, some Jews did convert to Christianity. The Church recorded these conversions as victories, evidence that the truth of Christianity was slowly winning over even the most stubborn unbelievers. But Archbishop Borromeo, as we saw earlier, was deeply cynical about these conversions. "I have little faith in them," he wrote. "Under the pretext of coming to our faith, I have found that many of them were seeking and had other temporal goals." What temporal goals? Better economic opportunities, escape from discriminatory laws, the ability to own property, practice trades, move freely. Conversion offered a path out of the legal restrictions that confined Jewish life. Some converts were sincere, others were strategic, and the Church's suspicion of converted Jews, codified in the Spanish doctrine of limpieza de sangre, reflected an awareness that conversion didn't always mean genuine belief. None of this justifies expulsion. Nothing the Jews of Milan did, or were accused of doing, warranted the destruction of their community. The fundamental driver of the expulsion was Spanish imperial ideology, reinforced by Counter-Reformation theology and lubricated by local economic resentments. But understanding the full picture helps explain why the expulsion succeeded where other persecutions had failed. The Senate's defense of the Jews was based on their economic utility. Once that utility could be questioned, once the Jews could be portrayed as not holding up their end of the bargain, the political calculation shifted. Philip II didn't expel the Jews of Milan because of what they did. He expelled them because of who he was and what his empire represented. But the accusations, fair or unfair, provided the moral cover that made expulsion politically possible. And the citizens of Cremona and Pavia, who offered considerable sums of money to make the Jews disappear, weren't motivated by theology alone. They were motivated by economic competition, by resentment of Jewish privileges, by the outrage they felt when a Christian was executed for killing a Jew. The expulsion was the product of ideology and interest working together. The Spanish crown provided the ideological commitment. The Counter-Reformation Church provided the moral framework. And local Christian merchants and citizens provided the economic motivation and political pressure. The Jews of Milan were caught between all of these forces. They had navigated them successfully for decades. But in the end, the forces were too strong. Now let's talk about how the expulsion was actually carried out. The physical process was relatively orderly, at least by the standards of medieval and early modern expulsions. There were no mass killings, but no pogroms, no confiscation of Jewish children for forced baptism. The Jews were given time to settle their affairs, sell their property, collect their debts. They were given soldiers to escort them safely out of the territory. This wasn't generosity. It was calculation. Philip II had agreed that the crown would repay debts owed to Jews before expelling them. This meant the Spanish state had a financial interest in ensuring an orderly liquidation. If Jews were simply driven out with nothing, the crown would still owe them money. Better to let them collect what they could, settle their accounts, and leave with whatever they could carry. The 5,000 florins given to the poor for travel expenses came from the ducal treasury. It was a pittance, but it was something. The state was acknowledging, however minimally, that it bore some responsibility for the people it was expelling. This is what made the Milan expulsion different from the violent expulsions that had characterized earlier centuries. It was bureaucratic, procedural, organized. The machinery of the early modern state, with its censuses and reports and financial accountings, had replaced the mob violence of medieval persecution. Whether this made the experience better or worse for the people being expelled is hard to say. On one hand, they weren't being murdered. On the other hand, they were being erased by paperwork, their lives reduced to entries in a ledger, their centuries of presence terminated by official decree. And what of the property they left behind? Synagogues were closed. Some were converted to other uses. The Jewish cemeteries remained, but without Jews to maintain them. They began to deteriorate. The homes in the Via Giudecca in Cremona passed to new owners. The loan banks were shut down or taken over by the Monte di Pietà. A community that had built institutions over generations saw those institutions dismantled in months. The Hebrew book printing industry that had flourished in Cremona was already damaged before the expulsion. In 1559, as part of the Counter-Reformation's assault on Jewish learning, over 10,000 Jewish books had been burned at the convent of San Domenico in Cremona. The printing houses had struggled to recover. Now, with no Jewish community to serve, they closed entirely. And what of the people themselves? Where did they go? That's the next part of the story. Because the expulsion from Milan wasn't the end. It was a dispersal. 900 people scattered across the Italian peninsula, carrying with them whatever they could save, looking for new places that would allow them to exist. Some found refuge. Some found only temporary shelter before the next expulsion. and Milan itself would feel the consequences of their departure for decades to come. Where do you go when your home expels you? For the Jews of Milan in 1597, the answer depended on geography, connections, and luck. The closest refugee was Mantua, just 60 miles southeast of Cremona. The Gonzaga dukes who ruled Mantua had a long history of tolerating Jewish communities. They valued Jewish merchants, bankers, and artisans, and critically they were willing to accept refugees from neighboring territories. Mantua wasn't paradise. Jews there lived under restrictions, confined to certain neighborhoods, limited in their occupations, but subject to the whims of ducal policy. But compared to exile with nowhere to go, Mantua was salvation. The Gonzaga court was also a center of culture and learning. Jewish musicians, artists, and scholars found patronage there. The community included wealthy bankers who financed ducal projects and poor laborers who scraped by on the margins. It was a place where Jews could rebuild, where the skills they had developed in Milan could find new applications. Mantua became the primary destination for Milan's expelled Jews. Families who had lived in Cremona, Alessandria, Lodi, and Pavia packed what they could carry and made the journey east. Some had relatives already in Mantua who could help them get established. Others arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever gold they had managed to hide. The journey itself was dangerous. The roads of northern Italy were not safe. Bandits preyed on travelers. Soldiers from the ongoing wars might stop anyone who looked vulnerable. Refugees carrying their life savings were obvious targets. We don't know how many Milan Jews died on the road to their new homes. We don't know how many were robbed, how many fell ill, how many simply gave up. The historical record tells us where they ended up, not what they suffered getting there. But Mantua wasn't the only option. Some headed to Modena, ruled by the Este family. Others went to Reggio, also under Este control. A few made it to the Venetian territories, settling in Verona or Padua or the great ghetto of Venice itself. The Venetian Republic had a complicated relationship with Jews, confining them to the ghetto at night, but allowing them significant economic freedom during the day. Venice was the largest Jewish community in Italy at the time. The ghetto, established in 1516, was cramped and controlled. But it was also a center of Jewish culture, learning, and commerce. For refugees from Milan, Venice offered both opportunity and community. They could find other Jews who spoke their language, practiced their customs, understood their situation. Some Milan Jews went even further. A few made it to the Papal States, settling in Rome or Ancona, where small Jewish communities persisted despite papal restrictions. Others crossed the Alps into the German lands or traveled east toward the growing Jewish centers of Poland and Lithuania. Each destination had its own rules, its own restrictions, its own precarious arrangements. The Jews of Milan weren't escaping persecution. They were simply moving from one form of tolerated existence to another. And they brought something valuable with them: expertise. After generations in the Duchy of Milan, these families had developed sophisticated knowledge of banking, trade, and commerce. They had international connections, family networks stretching across the Mediterranean. They knew how to navigate the complex legal and economic systems of Italian city-states. This made them useful to their new hosts. The same skills that had kept them alive in Milan could keep them alive elsewhere. Within a few years, former Milan Jews were establishing themselves in Mantuan commerce, contributing to the economies of Modena and Ferrara, integrating into the Jewish communities of Venice. The integration wasn't always smooth. Existing Jewish communities sometimes resented the influx of refugees who competed for limited economic opportunities and strained communal resources. But over time, the former Milan Jews found their place. They married into local families. They established new businesses. They continued the religious and intellectual traditions they had maintained in Cremona. Some families kept records of their Milanese origins for generations. The memory of what they had lost didn't disappear overnight. Family names, traditions, documents all carried traces of the community that had been destroyed. But what happened to the place they left behind? The Duchy of Milan discovered almost immediately that expelling its Jews had consequences. Credit dried up. The Monte di Pietà, which the Franciscans had promoted as a replacement for Jewish moneylending, couldn't handle the volume of demand. They had limited capital. They had bureaucratic procedures. They couldn't serve all the small borrowers who had previously relied on Jewish banks. Merchants who had used Jewish credit to finance their operations suddenly found themselves without access to capital. Farmers who had borrowed against future harvests couldn't get loans. The poor, who had pawned their possessions to Jewish lenders for small sums, had nowhere to turn. This wasn't theoretical. The documentary record shows concrete economic disruption in the years following the expulsion. The problem was structural. The Monte di Pietà had been designed as charitable institutions, serving the deserving poor with modest loans at low interest. They weren't equipped to replace a commercial banking system. They didn't have the capital reserves. They didn't have the expertise. They didn't have the networks. Jewish bankers had operated on a commercial basis, taking risks, extending credit to merchants and traders who might default, financing ventures that might fail. The Monte couldn't do this. They were too conservative, too limited, too concerned with charitable mission rather than commercial function. The result was a credit crunch. Economic activity slowed. Merchants who had relied on Jewish loans to fund inventory purchases couldn't restock their shops. Craftsmen who had borrowed to buy materials couldn't complete orders. The wheels of commerce ground to a halt in ways that the architects of expulsions had never anticipated. And here's the most revealing part. Within 2 decades, people were trying to bring the Jews back. In 1619, just 22 years after the expulsion, there was a formal proposal to readmit Jews to the Duchy of Milan. The economic problems had become severe enough that even officials who had supported expulsion were reconsidering. The proposal failed. The ideological commitment to a Jew-free territory was still too strong. The Counter-Reformation Church was still powerful. The memory of the campaign for expulsion was still fresh. But the fact that the proposal was made at all tells us something important. The expulsion hadn't solved any problems. It had created new ones. The people who had agitated for expulsion, who had paid money to make it happen, were now living with the consequences of getting what they wanted. The citizens of Cremona and Pavia, who had offered bribes to the king, were now dealing with a collapsed credit market. The merchants who had resented Jewish competition were now struggling without access to capital. The poor, who had depended on Jewish pawnbrokers for small emergency loans, had nowhere to turn. This is what happens when ideology overrides pragmatism. The expulsion made sense from a theological standpoint, perhaps, but it made no sense economically. The people who carried it out discovered this too late. In 1626, another attempt was made to readmit Jews. Again, it failed. In 1633, yet another proposal. Same result. Each attempt was blocked by a combination of church opposition and residual anti-Jewish sentiment. The ideology that had demanded expulsion couldn't acknowledge that expulsion had been a mistake. To readmit Jews would be to admit that the entire enterprise had been wrong. So the absence continued, year after year, in decade after decade, generation after generation. The pattern is striking. Every few years, someone in the Milanese government would look at the economic situation, remember that Jews had once provided essential services, and suggest bringing them back. And every time the proposal was blocked. The Spanish crown, which still ruled Milan, remained committed to the ideology of expulsion. The church remained opposed to Jewish readmission, and local interests that might have benefited from Jewish return weren't powerful enough to overcome these obstacles. Meanwhile, the physical traces of Jewish presence gradually disappeared. The synagogues were closed, converted to other uses, or demolished. The Jewish cemeteries, unattended, fell into disrepair. The homes in the Via Giudecca passed to Christian owners. The Hebrew printing presses, which had made Cremona famous throughout the Jewish world, fell silent. By the middle of the 17th century, only scattered remnants remained. A family name here, a street name there. The memory of what had existed was fading into history. So the absence continued, year after year, decade after decade. The Jewish community of Milan, which had existed in some form since the Roman Empire, which had survived the fall of Rome and the chaos of the Middle Ages, which had navigated the complex politics of Visconti and Sforza rule, which had endured 3 decades of Spanish pressure before finally succumbing, was gone. And it would stay gone for nearly 2 centuries. Jews were not legally permitted to return to the Duchy of Milan until the armies of Napoleon swept through northern Italy in the 1790s, all bringing with them the revolutionary principles of equality and religious freedom. The emancipation of Italian Jews followed French conquest, not Italian choice. This means that for almost 200 years, from 1597 to the late 18th century, there was no Jewish community in Milan, no synagogues, no rabbis, no Jewish merchants or bankers or physicians. The city that had once been connected to Jewish life across Europe was cut off entirely. Consider what this absence meant in concrete terms. The Hebrew printing industry that had flourished in Cremona was destroyed. Before the expulsion, Cremona had been one of the most important centers of Hebrew book production in Europe. Jewish and Christian printers had collaborated on religious texts, legal commentaries, and the works of philosophy. After the expulsion, the presses fell silent. The expertise was gone. The market was gone. Cremona's role in Jewish intellectual life ended overnight. The Talmudic academy that Joseph Ottolenghi had established, which had attracted students from across Europe, was closed. The tradition of Jewish scholarship that had made Cremona a center of learning was broken. Students who might have come to Cremona now went to Venice or Mantua or the academies of the Ottoman Empire. The commercial networks were severed. Jewish merchants in Milan had connections to trading communities across the Mediterranean. They imported spices, silk, and luxury goods. They extended credit to facilitate international trade. After the expulsion, these connections were lost. The former Milan Jews carried their networks with them to Mantua and Venice, but Milan itself was cut off. The medical expertise disappeared. Jewish physicians had served at the Sforza court and continued to practice under Spanish rule. Their knowledge of Arabic and Hebrew medical texts, their connections to medical traditions in the Islamic world, their expertise that had been valued despite religious prejudice, all of this left with them. What did Milan lose in those 2 centuries? We can only speculate. The Jews who were expelled took their skills and connections with them. The Hebrew printing industry that had flourished in Cremona was destroyed. The commercial networks that had linked Milan to Jewish trading communities across the Mediterranean were severed. Other Italian cities that maintained Jewish communities, like Venice and Livorno, became centers of Mediterranean commerce in the 17th and 18th centuries. Milan, cut off from these networks, did not. Was this because of the expulsion? Partially. Many factors shaped Milan's economic development, but the expulsion certainly didn't help. The credit vacuum persisted for years. The commercial networks were never rebuilt. The expertise that had accumulated over generations was lost forever. And there's a human cost that's harder to measure. Generations of Milanese Christians grew up without ever meeting a Jew. Whatever they knew about Jews came from sermons, from the liturgical commemoration of Simon of Trent, from cultural stereotypes passed down through generations. The living reality of Jewish neighbors, Jewish merchants, Jewish people going about their daily lives was replaced by abstraction. This kind of isolation breeds ignorance, and ignorance, as history repeatedly demonstrates, breeds prejudice. When Jews finally returned to Milan in the 19th century, they were returning to a city that had spent 200 years without them. They were strangers in a place where their ancestors had lived for 1,000 years. But let's return to the immediate aftermath of 1597, because there are a few more details that deserve attention. The handful of Jewish families who remained in the duchy under temporary exemptions gradually diminished. By 1629, only the Soave family was still in Cremona. By the middle of the 17th century, even they were gone. The process of erasure was slow but complete. The physical traces of Jewish presence faded as well. The Via Giudecca in Cremona kept its name, eventually shortened to Via Zuecca, but the Jewish homes and businesses were long gone. If there had been synagogues in the smaller communities, they were converted to other uses or demolished. The cemeteries, unattended, fell into disrepair. Historian Shlomo Simonson, whose 4-volume collection, The Jews in the Duchy of Milan, documents the entire history in painstaking archival detail, noted that Milan was unusual among Italian cities in that no old ghetto or ancient synagogue survived. The erasure was that complete. Simon Sacerdoti, the spy who had served Philip II so faithfully, fades from the historical record after the expulsion. We don't know when he died or what he did with the exemption that saved him and his family. He had won a personal victory, but his community was gone. Joseph HaKohen, the Jewish chronicler who documented the expulsion in his book Emek HaBaka, The Valley of Tears, recorded the events with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. His chronicle was one of the earliest Jewish attempts to document the history of persecution, and the Milan expulsion took its place in a long catalogue of suffering. And Philip II? He died in September 1598, just over a year after the expulsion was completed. He had finally achieved what his father had done in Naples 57 years earlier. The Spanish territories in Italy were, at last, officially cleansed of Jewish presence. Whether this brought Philip any satisfaction in his final months, we cannot know. He died believing he had served God and the Church. He died believing he had done the right thing. The Jews of Milan would have disagreed. But before we move to what this story means, we need to examine one more aspect of the expulsion itself, the question of timing. Why 1597? After 32 years of resistance, what finally broke the logjam? Part of the answer is exhaustion. The Senate had run out of arguments. Every practical objection had been raised and overruled. Every delay tactic had been tried. The political will to resist in Milan was depleted. Part of the answer is money. The citizens of Cremona and Pavia had been offering considerable sums to the crown in exchange for expulsion. At some point, the financial calculation shifted. The bribes offered for expulsion exceeded the tax revenue from keeping Jews. Part of the answer is Philip himself. As the king approached death, he became more determined to complete his religious mission. The Counter-Reformation was in full swing. The Council of Trent had reaffirmed Catholic doctrine. The Jesuit order was spreading across Europe. Philip wanted to leave behind a legacy of Catholic purity, and that meant finishing the expulsion his father had begun. And part of the answer is that the Jews themselves had become easier to expel. The community was smaller than it had been a century earlier. The economic importance of Jewish lending had declined with the spread of the Monte di Pietà. The political coalition that had protected them, the governors and senators who had argued for tolerance, had weakened over time. None of these factors alone explains the timing, but together they created a moment when resistance finally became impossible. The spring of 1597 was when that moment arrived. One final detail deserves mention. The expulsion decree specifically exempted Jews who converted to Christianity. This was standard practice in Spanish expulsions. The goal was officially religious, not racial. Or Jews who accepted baptism could stay. Some did convert. The historical record doesn't tell us how many, but we know that conversions occurred. For some families, the prospect of losing everything, their homes, their businesses, their communities, was too much to bear. They chose survival through baptism. Archbishop Borromeo, as we saw, was skeptical of these conversions, and the Spanish doctrine of limpieza de sangre meant that even converted Jews faced discrimination. But conversion offered at least a chance to remain in the territory, to keep some of what they had built. We should not judge those who converted. Faced with a choice between exile and baptism, between preserving their faith and preserving their families, they made impossible decisions. History records their choices but not their inner lives, their grief, their shame, or their relief. The majority did not convert. The 900 who left in spring 1597 left as Jews, carrying their faith with them into exile. Whatever else they lost, they kept that. So what does this story tell us? It tells us that expulsion is never just about hatred. The 1597 expulsion was the product of imperial ideology, counter-Reformation theology, economic competition, and local resentment all working together. No single factor explains it. The Spanish crown provided the will. The church provided the moral framework. The citizens of Cremona and Pavia provided the money and the pressure. And the 32 years of local resistance showed that even within this system, there were people who saw expulsion as unnecessary and destructive. It tells us that protection is always conditional. The Jews of Milan had survived for centuries by making themselves useful. They paid taxes. They provided credit. They served as spies and informants. They did everything the rulers asked of them. And in the end, it wasn't enough. When the ideology of the ruling power demanded their removal, no amount of usefulness could save them. It tells us that bureaucracy can be a weapon. The 1597 expulsion wasn't a pogrom. It was a procedure. Forms were filled out. Censuses were taken. Debts were calculated. The machinery of the early modern state was turned against a minority population with all the cold efficiency of administrative process. And it tells us that absence has consequences. The Duchy of Milan thought it was solving a problem by expelling its Jews. Instead, it created new problems, economic disruption that lasted for decades, proposals for readmission that never succeeded, 2 centuries of isolations from the Jewish world. The expulsion of 1597 was supposed to be a purification. It turned out to be an amputation. 900 people, 1,000 years of history, gone in a single spring. The streets of Cremona are still there. The Via Zuecca still exists, but the people who gave it its name have been gone for 4 centuries. And the story of why they were forced to leave, of the 32 years they fought to stay, of the king and the archbishop and the spy and the citizens who wanted them gone, is a story that deserves to be remembered. Because expulsions don't just happen. They're made by people with power making choices for reasons that seemed sufficient at the time. The Jews of Milan learned that in 1597. The question is whether anyone else learned it from them. The expulsion of 1597 was not the largest or most famous Jewish expulsion in European history. 900 people is a small number compared to the tens of thousands expelled from Spain, or the hundreds of thousands who would later perish in the 20th century. But the story matters because of what it reveals about how persecution works. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was a 32-year process conducted through bureaucratic channels, debated in official reports, delayed by administrative procedures. The machinery of the early modern state, with its censuses and petitions and royal decrees, was turned against a minority population with meticulous attention to procedure. The people who carried out the expulsion weren't monsters. The Spanish governors who delayed it for decades weren't heroes. Everyone involved was operating within systems, following incentives, responding to pressures. The king wanted religious purity. The church wanted theological conformity. The citizens of Cremona wanted economic advantage. The Senate wanted to avoid disruption. The Jews wanted to survive. Each actor made choices that seemed reasonable from their own perspective. And the sum of those choices was catastrophe for 900 people. That's how persecution usually works, not through the actions of uniquely evil individuals, but through the ordinary functioning of systems that devalue certain lives. The ideological commitment to expulsion didn't require hatred. It just required a belief that Jewish presence was a problem to be solved, a contamination to be cleansed, an anomaly to be corrected. The Jews of Milan fought that belief for 32 years. They argued, negotiated, bribed, and pleaded. They made themselves useful in every way they could imagine. And in the end, it wasn't enough. That's the tragedy. Not that they didn't try, but that trying wasn't enough. The system was rigged against them from the start. No amount of service, no amount of loyalty, no amount of usefulness could overcome the ideological conviction that they didn't belong. The streets of Cremona are still there. The Via Zuecca still exists, a linguistic fossil preserving the memory of the Jews who once lived there. But the community itself, the synagogues and schools and families and traditions that have persisted for centuries, is gone. 900 people, 1,000 years of history, erased in a single spring. The story deserves to be remembered, not because it was the worst persecution, but because it was so ordinary, so procedural, so bureaucratic. Because expulsions don't just happen. They're made by people with power making choices for reasons that seem sufficient at the time. The Jews of Milan learned that in 1597. The question is whether the rest of us have learned it since. History tends to repeat itself, not because human nature is unchanging, but because the structures that enable persecution remain remarkably durable. The combination of ideological commitment, economic resentment, and bureaucratic efficiency that destroyed the Jewish community of Milan can be found in many other times and places. The lesson of 1597 is not that persecution is inevitable. It's that persecution is constructed. It requires ideology to provide justification. It requires economic interests to provide motivation. It requires bureaucracy to provide implementation. And it requires ordinary people to acquiesce, to look away, to tell themselves that someone else will handle it. The Jews of Milan had allies, governors who helped them delay, senators who argued their case, officials who testified to their good character. But in the end, those allies couldn't overcome the combination of forces arrayed against them. That's the warning. Allies aren't enough. Good intentions aren't enough. The 900 Jews who left Milan in the spring of 1597 couldn't dismantle those structures. They could only endure them. They left behind everything they had built, everything their ancestors had built, and started over somewhere else. Some of their descendants are probably still alive today. Somewhere in the world, there are people who carry the genetic heritage and cultural memory of the Jews of Cremona, of Alessandria, of Lodi and Pavia. They may not know it. The connection may have been lost over 4 centuries of dispersion and assimilation. But the history remains. The documents in the archives of Milan and Simancas and the Vatican, the chronicles of Joseph HaKohen, the scholarship of Shlomo Simonson and Flora Casson, and others who have pieced together the story from fragmentary sources. The community is gone, but the memory persists. This is a story of persistence and failure, of resistance and ultimate defeat, of a community that fought for 32 years and lost everything in a single spring.